The creek had been dry for as long as anyone in the hollow could remember, which in the mountains of western North Carolina meant at least 2 generations, and possibly 3. The old people called it Salt Lick Run because their parents had called it that, and their parents had called it that because there had once been a salt lick at its head where the deer came down from the ridges in autumn and stood in the running water and licked the mineral stones and were easy to shoot. But the salt lick was dry now, and the creek was dry now, and the bed that remained was a channel of smooth river stones and red clay and sand that wound through the bottom of a narrow hollow between 2 forested ridges for 3/4 of a mile before emptying into the Pigeon River below. The bed was 6 to 8 feet wide and 3 to 4 feet deep, cut into the hollow floor over centuries of flowing water, its banks held in place by the roots of sycamore and tulip poplar and river birch that had grown along its edges when there was water to grow beside, and that now stood above the empty channel like sentinels guarding a road that no one traveled. The banks were red clay over limestone, the clay soft enough to dig, the limestone hard enough to hold, and the combination creating walls that stood vertical without slumping, as stable as masonry, as waterproof as brick. Delacroix found the creek bed on a September afternoon in 1882, walking the hollow because walking was the only thing she could do that did not require thinking about the thing she could not stop thinking about, which was the fact that her husband Martin was 2 months dead from a copperhead bite on the left ankle, and that she was 22 years old and alone on 60 acres of mountain land that produced barely enough to feed 2 people, and now had to feed 1 person who had lost the appetite for everything, including survival. She was a sturdy woman, 5 feet 5, wide-hipped and strong-legged, built low to the ground the way mountain women were built when the mountains were still vertical work rather than horizontal scenery. She had thick, dark hair that she wore in a braid wound into a crown on top of her head, brown eyes that were warm when she was not grieving and flat when she was, a broad face with a strong nose and a jaw that could crack hickory nuts and had on more than one occasion. Her skin was the deep brown of a woman who had worked outside since childhood, not tanned but weathered, the color integrated into the skin rather than layered on top of it. She wore a faded blue cotton dress, a canvas vest that had been Martin's, leather boots that she had resoled twice with pieces of old belting, and a wide-brimmed straw hat with a torn crown that let the sun hit the top of her head when she forgot to tilt it forward. She stood in the dry creek bed and looked at the walls. The red clay banks, 4 feet tall, solid and vertical, running the length of the hollow like the walls of a long, narrow room that had no floor and no ceiling. The sycamores and tulip poplars arching over the creek bed from both sides, their branches interlocking overhead to form a green tunnel in summer that filtered the sunlight into a moving pattern of green and gold on the creek bed below. She looked at the dry creek bed, and she saw a garden, not a surface garden. The thin soil, rain-dependent, deer-ravaged scratch patches that every mountain family planted on whatever south-facing slope was available and prayed over until the frost or the drought or the beetles ended the prayer. She saw an underground garden, still seeped from the hillside at the head of the creek. The water was clear and cold, and the air was fresh and clean. The creek was a natural wonder, a testament to the power of nature to create beauty, and life still seeped from the hillside at the head of the hollow, even though it no longer produced enough flow to run the creek. A garden that used the creek bed not as a path for water, but as a container for soil, not as a channel, but as a trough, not as something empty, but as something waiting to be filled. If you want to know what a widow with 60 acres and a dry creek did, that fed an entire hollow through 3 winters and changed how a mountain community understood the ground beneath their feet, subscribe to The Warm Floor and tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. The work began in October and continued through the winter and into the following spring, because what Della was building was not a garden. It was an agricultural system, and systems take time. The first section was 60 feet long, a straight stretch of the creek bed near the cabin where the banks were 4 feet tall on both sides and the bed was 7 feet wide. Della cleared the creek stones from this section, stacking them along the bank tops where they would serve as low retaining walls and expose the sandy soil beneath. The soil was poor, leached of nutrients by centuries of flowing water, but it was deep and loose and well drained, the ideal base for what she planned to build on top of it. She built the garden soil from the hollow itself, leaf mold from the forest floor, years of accumulated decomposition scraped from under the sycamores and poplars in thick dark layers that smelled of earth and rain. Red clay from the banks, dug in small amounts to avoid weakening the walls. Ash from her cabin fireplace, rich in potassium and phosphorus. Manure from the 2 goats she kept in a pen beside the cabin. Creek sand for drainage. She layered these materials in the creek bed the way a mason layers brick. Leaf mold, clay, ash, manure, sand, leaf mold again, building a growing medium that was 18 inches deep, dark, loose, and rich with the particular fertility that comes from combining what the mountain discards with what a farm produces. The creek banks were the walls of the garden, 4 feet of red clay and limestone on both sides, absorbing the sun's heat during the day and radiating it into the garden bed at night. This thermal mass effect was critical. The banks functioned as heat batteries, storing solar energy in their clay and stone bulk and releasing it slowly through the night, keeping the soil temperature in the garden bed 10 to 15 degrees warmer than the exposed surface soil on the hillside above. In spring, this meant Della could plant 2 to 3 weeks earlier than her neighbors. In autumn, it meant the first frost that killed the surface gardens left her creek bed garden untouched, because the radiant heat from the banks kept the air temperature in the channel above freezing for weeks after the hillside froze. The canopy was the second advantage. The sycamores and poplars that arched over the creek bed created a natural filter, dappling the summer sun to prevent scorching while admitting enough light for growth, breaking the force of heavy rain so that the soil was watered gently rather than pounded, and blocking the wind that dried surface gardens and stressed the plants. In autumn, when the leaves fell, the canopy opened and admitted the full low-angle sun that warmed the creek banks and extended the growing season. In winter, the bare branches offered no obstruction to the weak sun, allowing maximum warming of the thermal mass banks. The canopy was, in effect, a seasonal greenhouse, filtering light when there was too much and admitting it when there was too little, automatically, without any intervention or adjustment. The irrigation came from the spring at the head of the hollow. The spring produced a trickle, perhaps a gallon per minute, not enough to run the creek, but more than enough to water a garden. Della dug a shallow channel from the spring to the head of her garden section, allowing the water to seep along the creek bed at the base of the growing medium, wetting the soil from below rather than from above. This sub-irrigation kept the root zone consistently moist without wetting the leaves, which reduced fungal disease and eliminated the need for surface watering. The excess water, what the plants did not absorb, drained through the sandy base and continued down the dry creek bed, lost to the ground rather than to evaporation. The first crop went in on the 20th of March, 1883, 3 weeks before her neighbors planted their surface gardens, because the creek bed soil temperature was already 55 degrees while the surface soil was still in the low 40s. She planted potatoes, beans, squash, turnips, carrots, onions, cabbage, and corn, the standard mountain garden, but planted in a container that was not standard, that was protected and warmed and watered in ways that surface gardens could not match. If this story has touched your heart, take a moment to share it and subscribe to The Warm Floor, because stories like these deserve to be remembered. The results were visible by June. The creek bed garden was producing at a rate that Della's surface patch, a small plot on the south slope above the cabin that she maintained for comparison, could not approach. The beans were climbing their poles a week ahead of schedule. The squash vines were spreading beyond their allotted space and had to be trained along the creek bank walls. The potatoes, planted in the deep, loose soil of the creek bed, were producing tubers at a depth and size that the thin mountain soil above could never support. The corn, planted in a single row down the center of the creek bed where the canopy gap was widest, was shoulder high by the 4th of July and tasseling by the end of the month. The first person to see the garden was Lucius Hale, who owned the adjoining 60 acres and who walked the property line in July to check whether Della's goats had gotten into his corn again. They had not. The goats were penned, but Lucius followed the hollow down to the creek bed and stopped at the edge of the bank and looked down into a 7-foot wide strip of green that was so dense and productive that it looked like a different climate from the sparse rocky hillside above it. "Lord God," Lucius said, which was not a prayer, but an honest assessment of the situation. He told his wife Beulah. Beulah told her sister. Her sister told the women at the church in Waynesville. And by August, the creek bed garden was the subject of a debate in the hollow that divided roughly along the lines that all debates in mountain communities divide. Those who thought Della Crowell was clever, those who thought she was lucky, and those who thought she was both, but would not admit it, because admitting that a 22-year-old widow had outsmarted every farmer in the hollow was an admission that no one over 40 was prepared to make. Virgil Nash fell into the third category. Virgil was the oldest farmer in the hollow, 67, lean and hard as an oak root, with a white beard and blue eyes that had watched 67 years of mountain weather destroy 67 years of mountain gardens, and who regarded the creekbed project with the suspicion of a man who had been disappointed by innovation before and expected to be disappointed again. "Creeks flood," Virgil said, when the subject came up at the store in Waynesville. "That bed will be under 4 feet of water come spring rain, and everything she's planted will wash down to the Pigeon River and feed the fish. She's gardening in a drainage ditch." If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button right now. It is free, takes a second, and helps the Warm Floor reach more people who need to hear it. Now back to the story. Virgil was not wrong about the flooding. He was wrong about the timing and the consequences. The creek bed did flood, but not in spring. It flooded in August of 1883, when a thunderstorm dropped 2 inches of rain on the ridges above the hollow in 40 minutes, and the runoff channeled down every slope and gully into the hollow bottom, filled the dry creek bed to a depth of 2 feet for approximately 4 hours before draining. The garden survived. The plants, rooted in 18 inches of loose soil, that was itself sitting on a bed of permeable sand and gravel, were submerged to the lower leaves but not uprooted, because the flow in the old creek bed was slow and spread wide rather than fast and channeled. The creek bed's gentle gradient and wide floor diffused the floodwater's energy, turning what would have been a destructive current in a narrow channel into a broad, shallow flow that passed over the garden without tearing it apart. When the water drained, the plants were muddy but intact. The soil was saturated but in place, and the creek bed had received a deep watering and a deposit of fresh silt from the hillside that added nutrients to the growing medium. Della had expected the flood. She had studied the creek bed before planting, noting the high watermarks on the bank walls, the debris lines in the sycamores, the gravel deposits that told the story of past flows. She knew the bed flooded in heavy rains. She planted accordingly, choosing varieties that tolerated temporary submersion, staking tall plants to resist the current, and timing her most vulnerable crops to avoid the late summer thunderstorm season. The flood was not a disaster. It was irrigation on a scale that her spring trickle could never match. The first full harvest came in October 1883, 1 year after Della began building the garden. The yield from the 60-foot creek bed section exceeded the yield from her surface garden by a factor she did not bother to calculate because the comparison was so lopsided as to be meaningless. The creek bed produced enough potatoes to fill the root cellar, enough beans to dry and store for 2 years, enough squash to line the cabin walls in orange and green, enough corn to grind and enough cabbage to ferment, and enough turnips and carrots and onions to fill every box and barrel and crock she owned. She extended the garden the following spring, adding another 40 feet of creek bed, bringing the total to 100 feet of cultivated channel. She experimented with new crops, lettuce and radishes in the cooler sections near the spring, pumpkins and melons in the widest sections where the sun reached the bed floor, herbs along the bank edges where they could cascade down the clay walls and be harvested without stepping into the bed. By the autumn of 1884, the garden was producing more than Della could eat, preserve, or store. She began trading eggs, butter, cheese from her goats, and now vegetables and preserved goods from the creek bed garden. She traded at the store in Waynesville and at the doors of neighbors who had watched the garden project with amusement and were now watching it with something that looked very much like hunger. The winter of 1884 to 85 tested the hollow. An early frost in late September killed the surface gardens across the district. Beans blackened on the vine, tomatoes frozen to mush, late corn destroyed in the field. Della's creek bed garden was untouched. The thermal mass of the clay banks, radiating stored heat into the channel through the night, kept the air temperature in the creek bed above freezing for 3 weeks after the first surface frost. She harvested her last beans on the 22nd of October, 4 weeks after her neighbors had lost theirs. The following spring was late, cold, and wet, with the last frost coming on the 15th of May, 6 weeks later than normal. Surface gardens could not be planted until June. Della planted her creek bed garden on the 1st of April because the bank-warmed soil had reached planting temperature a full 2 months before the exposed surface. She was harvesting radishes and lettuce while her neighbors were still waiting for the ground to thaw. The third winter was the one that proved everything. The winter of 1885 to 86 brought sustained cold that froze the ground to a depth of 14 inches on exposed surfaces, deep enough to destroy root vegetables stored in shallow root cellars and above-ground storage. The creek bed garden's root cellar, dug into the bank wall at the deepest point of the channel, maintained 48 degrees through the worst of it. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth, protecting the stored food the way the banks protected the growing plants, constantly, reliably, without effort or attention. In February, when Virgil Nash's last potatoes had frozen in his cellar, and his last cabbage had rotted in his spring house, and his pride had finally lost its argument with his stomach, he walked down the hollow to Della's creek bed and stood on the bank and looked at the 100-foot garden sleeping under its mulch of straw and leaves, and at the root cellar door set into the bank wall, and at the 22-year-old widow who was pulling a perfect cabbage from the cold storage and brushing the straw from its leaves. "I called this a drainage ditch," Virgil said. "It was," Della said. "Now it's something else." She gave him the cabbage. She gave him potatoes and turnips and a jar of pickled beans and a sack of dried corn. She gave him enough to eat for 2 weeks, freely, without trade or obligation, because the creek bed had given her more than she needed, and because the hollow was a place where people fed each other when the mountain couldn't. Virgil took the food. He stood on the bank of the dry creek that had become a garden, that had become a lifeline, and he looked at Della Crowell, sturdy, sun-darkened, her thick braid wound on her head like a crown, her brown eyes warm again for the first time in 3 years, and he said, "Martin would have been proud." "Martin would have helped," Della said, "but the creek did most of the work." Thank you for watching this story on the warm floor. If it reminded you that sometimes the emptiest places are waiting to be the fullest, please share it. Subscribe for more stories from the frontier, and tell us in the comments, what would you have built? By the spring of 1886, 4 families in the hollow had begun converting sections of the dry creek bed into garden plots, following Della's method: cleared beds, layered soil, sub-irrigation from the spring, thermal mass banks for frost protection. The 100-foot garden became 200, then 300, the cultivated sections extending down the hollow like green beads on a string, each family tending their own stretch. The dry creek bed transformed from an empty channel into a communal garden that fed the hollow through 3 winters, and then through every winter that followed. Della lived on the 60 acres for 19 years. She never remarried, though Ephraim Cope, a traveling root buyer who passed through the hollow twice a year, asked her 3 times, and each time she told him that she was married to the creek bed and the creek bed did not share. She expanded the garden to 200 feet, experimented with fruit trees trained against the warm south-facing bank walls, peach and apple espaliered flat against the red clay where the radiant heat ripened fruit 2 weeks ahead of freestanding trees on the hillside, and developed a system of movable canvas frames that she stretched across the creek bed on the coldest nights, creating a covered garden channel that extended her growing season into December and began it again in February. The creek bed was not a garden. It was an idea. The idea that the earth offers more than its surface, that the spaces left behind by water can be filled with food, and that a woman who looks at an empty channel and sees abundance is seeing the truth that the channel was always waiting to tell. Settle back, listen carefully, and journey with us through the legends, hard truths, and enduring wisdom of the American frontier. Subscribe to the warm floor. The fire is warm, the night is still, and the frontier has much to teach.